Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Grit Alter, Alessio Di Paolo, Pamela February and Frank J. Müller will talk about digital media.
So here we go. One of the main things we need to take into consideration when creating inclusive learning environments is the media and material we use. My impression is that a lot of the materials that are used in classrooms are based on verbal and or visual text, but then there are a lot of students who find it difficult to actually access this kind of text and will not benefit from this as much as others. In this work, we will look into the intricacies of designing inclusive media and material. Let me start off with a rather general question. What is a medium?
Well, yeah, this is really a rather general question, and I'm sure you, whoever you ask, you get a million answers to that question as well. So maybe I start off by differentiating a rather narrow and a more broader understanding of what media is. So if we have this more narrow understanding, we can look at research by people such as Schmidt and Strasser, who define media as a means by which information is conveyed over space. And I would also add over time, because then the content that is included in the media can also be perceived and accessed. In a broader understanding, we can look at research by people such as McLuhan, for example, who really sees that the medium is the message in itself or carries the message. And his example is light, for example, which would not be considered as a medium as such, but then at the same time, it enables colors. So in this sense, it can also be regarded as a medium. A common understanding, I guess, is somewhere in between. So we may say that anything that carries information and that can be perceived by different perception channels can be considered to be a medium. And certainly it is also the context that turns something into a medium. So for example, I can take a piece of driftwood and this can become a medium when I tell its story. I can also take a cup of, a cup of coffee and use this in an educational context where I talk about sustainability, and then this cup of coffee becomes a medium. So it is kind of the way a thing or an object is used that turns it into a medium. In education, we usually think of things such as textbooks or worksheets, apps and games, videos that are used as educational media. And again, it is the specific context in the classroom or in this educational setting that turns this into a medium. And if we want to differentiate different kinds of media, we can look into analog and digital media, we can look into printed media, there's interactive media, so there's all kinds of things that one can take into consideration there. But again, basically anything that communicates meaning and that carries content can be seen as a medium. And especially in inclusive classrooms, we can benefit from these because we can select media that address specific needs of individual students.
Thank you, Grit. This kind of indicates that so often in communicative situations, understanding something as a medium is based on the interplay of the sender, receiver, and intention. Let's go into more detail. Why do we think we need to create an inclusive learning environment?
Well, when teaching, you want to make sure that you include everyone. You want to make sure that you address everyone and that everyone who is in the classroom actually benefits from what it is that is happening. So we believe that the design of the material and the media is one way to achieve this, but then also certainly the way this material is used supports addressing everyone and including everyone. For example, we can make sure that we adapt our language level when we speak in classrooms to the level of the learners. We can make sure that the material that we use is on the level of the learners. We can make sure that if we have a verbal text, that we have that this is supplemented by audio files, for example. So the technology offers a lot of opportunities from which we can benefit. So for example, as I indicated, automatic readers or also visual organizers. We can adapt the form, but also the content of media and material to make it accessible for all. So, Alessio, another question that comes to my mind when we think about like this whole topic of digital media materials for all learners is, what can we learn from the use of digital material to support learning for all?
Oh, there is a very important question. Great for this. Thank you for this, Grit. Because we have rules born by the Conference of Salamanca in 1994 that is the educational for all. And a teacher who wants to respond to everyone's needs, as says Sibylla Aiello, has the difficult task of being able to integrate into the design activities to meet the individual needs of the students and for support their learning. Where students have difficulties, their teacher can resort to different resources to support them. When we think of analog media, then we adopted to different needs by changing the sites. For example, changing colors for the case of the students with a particular dyslexia. Or to make it easier to identify details, or adding verbal explains to what can be seen in the image. Modern technology, connected to the traditional means of learning, offers even more options, are very important in our society. For example, an image can be viewed on the interactive multimedia whiteboard to all zooming into details, and it's important when the students have a particular difficulty to search the details into the text, and the teacher can support this pupil to improve these particular skills by a whiteboard. Using software to work with maps in geography, in addition to textbooks, adapt learning environment for the student and create in him more motivation when using computer. All students have a particular type of cognitive skills and cognitive style, and the role of the teacher is to respond of their personal skills and their personal way to work. Leaving them choice supports the learning autonomy, creates ownership and self-reliance. Even better is when a source is made accessible, as in a case of open educational resource.
So, Pamela, what kind of texts and settings are beneficial for all learners?
Well, very often multimedia and multimodal texts are beneficial because they combine different modes and codes to transfer information. The only problem is, or only restriction is, that these are most beneficial when all the modes and codes carry the same information. Let me give you an example. Think of a picture book. We can read the verbal text in the book and we can look at the pictures. And when both the verbal text and the pictures are similar and same, they are most helpful to learners. The problem is when these are contradictory, when the picture says something else and the text says something else. And this confuses learners. And so it is important for teachers to choose the media that they use and the text that the books that they use wisely. In general, however, it's important to know that educators also vary the modes and the codes that they bring into the classroom and offer both visual codes, audiovisual, as well as kinesthetic representations of content, which allows everyone to benefit. Also, a combination is important. Audiovisual material connected with written text, while using other forms besides oral and written methods of explanation, watching videos instead of reading a text, for example, listening to music, and also carrying out multimedia exercises.
So yeah, thank you very much for this idea on the picture books, because usually in teaching we say that picture books are beneficial, that where there's a discrepancy between verbal and visual text, because this gives students something to think about. But then apparently it seems to be the case that in inclusive settings, we need to choose picture books where verbal and visual text match more, because the students are referring to, or the students may refer, or individual students may refer to different modes. But if we still want them to understand the story, these can't be too contradictory. That's very interesting.
Yeah, because the one has to support the other.
Yeah.
For learners, especially for those that have special needs.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
And you know, I have a friend, Alessio, and he has an example from music, because this is his expertise and how this helps. Remember, we spoke about music as a format. Mm-hmm. Alessio can speak to us about this. So, Grit, we just discussed learners as an aspect that we are looking at, and how we can improve and make sure that the lives of learners using digital material is catered for, or the education for learners is catered for. But what about teachers? Well, teachers are the key to ensuring that media materials are used successfully to create an inclusive learning environment. How do they do this, and how can they do this?
Very important question. The teachers do play a decisive role in classrooms, because in the end, they decide what kind of media are used and how these kind of media are used. So for them to be able to do this, it again boils down to their competences. Of course, on the one hand, digital competences and using the technology correctly, but then this also applies to the analog material. And here, the textbook actually plays a decisive role, because it is the one medium that is mostly used in classrooms, and it also prescribes what is happening in classrooms. So for a lot of teachers, and also that's something that people from research perspective argue, is that the textbook for them actually is more important than the curriculum, because they not always look at the curriculum to see what it is that they have to teach, but they rather take the textbook from the shelf and teach what is in the textbook. And in the end, a successful school year is defined by whether or not they finished the textbook and covered everything that is in the textbook. And this makes the textbook such an important medium, especially when we think of inclusive settings, because we know from studies that me and my colleagues did, for example, or also Thunderland, and there's a lot more, and they found that especially in the visual representations, we hardly have any diversity at all. So in the textbooks, we hardly have any person that sits in a wheelchair, for example. We hardly have any person that wears a headscarf, for example. The LGBTQI+ community is massively underrepresented in textbooks. We have a very heteronormative white male society, upper middle class, that is presented in textbooks. So it's not diverse at all, and that's one part. Also, what we need to pay attention to in textbooks is the way that tasks are set, for example, and some of these need to be tweaked as well. So for example, when a textbook suggests that a task should be done in partner work, the teacher may actually say, so here's a task, and you can choose whether you want to do this by yourself, with a partner, or in a small group. So offering the students choices of how they would like to proceed in solving tasks gives them ownership of the task as well. That's a key term that has appeared in our previous questions as well. We addressed the learners, parents, teachers, and technology itself. My first question for you, Pamela, in this context would be, what about the learners? What kind of, or why do we need to take them into consideration so much?
Well, Grit, the learners are the most important aspects of all these relationships. It's the reason why we have schools and learners going to schools. So they are key in everything. So when we design materials for learners, we need to pay attention to who they are as learners, what languages they speak, what are their competencies, their interests, and so forth, including other languages that they may speak, maybe not just the languages that are taught at school, but also the languages that they speak at home, and how we can scaffold learning and how we can support them in the best way to reach their goals. So the learners and their needs forms the core basis of incorporating media and materials. Schools and especially teachers, should carefully plan and select the appropriate technology that enhances traditional learning and teaching so that it benefits all the learners. And at the same time provide the necessary support for those learners who may need it at that time, and make sure that learners develop critical skills, and especially in this age where the digital paradigm shifts. This year it's this, we are able to do this via digital media. In 5 years' time, who knows? So we constantly have to be aware, how does this fit in with our learners? How do we accommodate them in this shifting paradigm? So first of all, so in order to do that, we need to make sure that we don't narrowly address just the needs of a learner in terms of what he's lacking, but look at the learner holistically, broadly, and cater for all the needs, not just this specific need. And so, and what this does is it pushes them to their boundaries further as to what they can do, and not just focus on that specific need. So we broaden the horizons for them and make sure that they learn something new and not just stay in their comfort zone. We also have to take into consideration that these learners did not just come from the air. They come from a home environment with different home experiences, and it's these experiences that we also need to take into consideration. And it may be different from the school setting. Think about children who might be new to the country, immigrant children, and so teachers need to be aware of all of this. Previously, we spoke about the digital divide and the digital gap. Now, this can be a challenge as well. And in what kind of technology do learners have access to? And how do they engage with whatever digital materials they have and their devices that they have? And who are the users and who are the prod users of these devices? And so digital competencies then play a role in this. As we said earlier, just owning a fancy laptop or the best cell phone or tablet doesn't mean that one actually knows how to use it, and use it to its fullest potential. Thus, we must make sure that this is also catered for. We previously discussed the importance of learners in the inclusive learning environment, and how their needs need to be catered for. And one of the aspects that came that we discussed was the fact that children come from different homes, environments, and teachers need to remember that. So what role do you think parents play in this context?
Oh, interesting. We need to be aware that learners are often influenced by what they experience at home, because certain options of the media that is consumed at home. We need to make sure that relying on parents or caretaker support does not create new inequalities. One means of avoiding this would be to invite the parents or caretakers to be on board as well. Offer, for example, workshops for them and be transparent regarding media, methods, content, and teaching objectives that are pursued in classrooms. This also regards offering the guidelines of how they can support their children at home. In their study, for example, Osorio Sets found that there are two things that can positively impact if parents are involved in the learning processes of their child. First, it's school providing or suggesting tools that are well structured. Secondly, is where parents see that the other people around them are on board, called group norm. On the other hand, if parents find the tools used to be too challenging, they are more likely to withdraw.
So I just mentioned technology and digital competences, but what kind of barriers and, more importantly, what kind of solutions are involved in this dimension?
Well, we should certainly not look at technology and use technology for the sake of technology and say, oh, this is something we should just use. We always have to keep the teaching objectives in mind and the learning objectives more specifically. A specific piece of technology can be a great benefit for some learners, but not necessarily for all learners. And teachers need to keep that in mind. For some, the light from the screens on their devices can be disturbing and distracting. And for others, it can be the blinking of all these buttons on a website and knowing where to push a button that can really be distracting. And here we think of children that have attention problems. And so we mustn't forget that often using digital media and using that learning is an interactive process. And because it's an interactive process, this doesn't mean it's for everyone wants to interact all the time. And so depending on the learner, cooperative learning and interactive learning is usually beneficial. And we all agree to that. That's one of the aims that we want. But depending on who the learner is, they might not think so. And they may want to sit and read and work on their own. So this links up with what you had said previously, Grit. And as with the other dimensions, digital literacy plays a role here as well. We need to make sure that the teacher education actually prepares new teachers for using material, being able to select the correct material, whether the material is digital or whether it's analog. That is a very important skill that they need to learn through teacher education, and especially in inclusive classrooms, as everyone needs to benefit through the use of whatever it is that the teacher is selecting and using in the classroom. One means of inviting all students to solve tasks is to provide scaffolding to them. Is there anything specific about scaffolding in inclusive classrooms? And how can we provide scaffolding to all learners? Great.
Yeah, thank you for this question. In general, scaffolding refers to providing systematic support to learners that helps them to solve tasks, right? So, and this kind of scaffolding, it can be either pre-planned or it can be spontaneous. So pre-planned, for example, when the teacher kind of anticipates where students may get stuck, so he can or they can prepare help sheets to give the students to continue working individually or in groups, but without the help of without further help by the teacher. Or it can be spontaneous, so when the teacher walks around the classroom and then they recognize that students get stuck, so they can give like advice on how to continue and how to move on with solving the task. Important is that scaffolding does not provide an answer, but it helps students to kind of get through or to manage, so to say, the zone of proximal development. So the student is at a certain stage, and then there's somewhere they need to get to, and this zone of being able to do something and not yet being able to do something is basically where learning happens. And in order to manage this zone, the teacher can provide scaffolding. And this can be analog media, like as I said, help sheets, for example, or the teacher can say, you know, in order to find this out, why don't you look it up in a book, or why don't you go to a dictionary, why don't you use like a lexicon, or, you know, try to find the information. In inclusive settings, where we can benefit from technology, hypertextuality, for example, would be another means of scaffolding. So the students get a text in a digital format, and then they can either search for material online, or the text itself is already prepared as a hypertext where they can click on specific terms that are then explained in case they need this explanation. They can click on terms and then they're referred to an image, for example, or to a scheme. When we think of teaching the water cycle, for example, of course we can give them a text in a book, but we can also give them a hypertext where they can, that is prepared so that they can link different resources to work and to learn with. So this would give students the option to kind of navigate the plurality of different modes and codes and then benefit for their own learning. So in order to, for this to be practical, we need multimedia learning environments where we have all of this technology and all of the material that we need at our disposal without like really trying to organize anything in advance, because this makes it easier for teachers and also learners to access those materials. And what is more important, in order to do this and for this to be successful, so to say, we need to teach teachers how to do that. So teachers' competences are crucial in this context, not only in terms of dealing with the technology and being able to use the technology accordingly, but also in terms of like managing the inclusive classrooms. So when we think of inclusive classrooms and digital media, the complexity that is often assumed, or the way in which it is often assumed that inclusive classrooms are already complex as such, when we add digital media to that, these get even more complex, because there may also be learners who cannot work on computers because like the light is disturbing to them, or like apps where everything moves is more disturbing to them than it is helpful. So one crucial aspect besides teacher education is also that they need to know their learners in detail in order for them to benefit from the material they use.
Thank you, Grit. And this brings me to an example where in a classroom where there are large classes, and for example in Africa there are large classes, technology helps a lot in the scaffolding, playing, for example, a game where different learners can learn at their own pace, and all learners are then supported in whatever way they need to. And while learners are busy on maybe an app for reading, the teacher can work with children who may have more severe needs. So technology helps in all ways, but I'm glad to know that it does not supersede the teacher, and that the teacher is still needed in all of this.
Yeah, exactly. Like no technology can replace good teaching, right? So and sound didactic methodological decisions. This is still what the teacher needs to do, right? So that cannot be replaced. So Alessio, can you provide an example for music, which is your field of expertise?
The association of music with the visual art, because it's important that the music is not considered as a alone subject, but in relation with also other subjects, as an example, the arts, is able to stimulate children to develop complex skills. There are precise studies conducted in Italy by Chiappetta Caiola or Amalia Lavinia Rizzo, and that studies the music in relation with the special educational needs with the dyslexia, because the music have a power to stimulate both cerebral hemispheres, the rational and the creative one. Generally, the two hemispheres work in separate, but when we sing, or when we play the piano, or when we took another activity with the music, contemporary neuroscientific studies have demonstrated that the music activates both cerebral hemispheres. There is a power of music.
So at the very beginning, we also mentioned that the body can be a medium in classrooms. So how do you think can the body as a medium be used in an inclusive way as well?
An inclusive body can be developed when it receives an active role, when the pupil is directly involved in the educational activity and is not simply conceived as a well-filed head, but as a well-made head, as C. Moreni in 1999. This implies that the subject learns with play, imitation, or experimentation with his own body to work, produce sounds, or imitate. Every single function of the body can lead to the acquisition of new skills. Paying attention to the body language languages, all of learners to acquire transversal skills such as the recognition of the other, the comparison with words as different, to understand and considerably apply to very concept of inclusion. And this is also the case when the education takes place in a virtual environment as 3D, where learners can replace their own avatars and participate virtually. Teachers need to make sure to use their body consciously, to differentiate between using body language that support learners in following instruction and explanations, and the body language that is distracting or makes students nervous. Additionally, explicit lip movement when speaking can support studying and better understanding what is being said.
We're looking at open educational resources. So the topic that we're looking at is what is the role of open education resources and what role can they play in designing and sharing accessible materials. So the first question I want to ask is, how can we use these OERs, open educational resources?
Okay, maybe we need to take a step back and say, what are OER? And therefore we look at the UNESCO definition. And they say, well, open education resources are learning, teaching and research materials in any form or format and medium. And they are licensed under public domain or under an open license. So this is one of the core aspects. And they provide great potential for effective, equitable, inclusive access to these open education resources. And they can be adapted and redistributed and used by all teachers. And this can help to support everyone, including individuals with disabilities and individuals coming from marginalized groups of learners. So these open education resources, they can help to meet the needs of individual learners and effectively promote gender equality and incentivize innovative pedagogical approaches. So regarding your question of how they might be used, we can turn to David Wiley, and he gathered 5 R's. And those 5 R's are: you are able to retain the material, you can revise the material, you can remix different OER material, you can reuse them in a public setting, so you can put it in your classroom or on your website or whatever, and you can redistribute those materials. So you have the legal right to share it again with your colleagues or other schools, and so it's not limited to your classroom.
That's a brilliant benefit in that you can remix, reuse, and all the other R's that you mentioned. But of what benefit would OERs be for teaching in diverse learning groups?
In inclusive education, we have a long tradition of adapting materials to the needs of the individual students. And the good thing about this OER concept is that if you create material, you're then now able to share this material under a clear and free license, and people are able to know what can I do with those materials. So all the energy that you put into the development of your materials is not just for the one single student, but can be used for all the others as well. And the background understanding is that there is no one material to rule them all. You don't have the perfect accessible material that is good for everybody. And even if you put a lot of effort into it, into the development, there will be some students that might need something different. And with the open license, you have the possibility to adapt the material that is there to the needs of those students. So the adaptability is one important prerequisite to ensure accessibility for all. And So there are two aspects. One is the aspect of the free license, and the other one is the aspect of the free formats. So you need to make sure that you have open formats like text files or HTML, and not use closed formats like PDF, for example. And also to think about how do you distribute your materials. If you put it on a server that is with a login and a password, and nobody could access it outside of your country, then it's not an open educational resource. But if you make it as open as possible, then everybody can build on those materials.
I think you probably just answered my next question, but how can we create more accessible OERs? And you started explaining about that. I don't know if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So what's really lovely about this digital space is you have a lot of space. Unlike textbooks, where you are limited to a certain number of pages, in the digital world, you can build on and say, well, let's add other perspectives on the same topic. And you can include the perspectives of different groups of people that are usually not represented in materials. So the question is, how can we involve them in the development of the materials? Because this is the interesting part, how to get the diversity of perspectives into school books, for example, or into learning materials. And there, this additional space is quite helpful. For many students in inclusive schools, a special level of vividness is needed. So obtaining appropriate and illustrative materials is quite complex. So, for example, to have graphics and videos that explain a certain process in more detail. It's something that is not very cheap, but if you have it on an open license, then you can reuse it and restructure it in different formats, and you don't have to always start over and over and over. So it makes sense to invest the money once properly and then share those materials.
And I mean, that is the true mark of open, the idea that the resources are open to everyone who needs, who wants and can use it. And so, I mean, you've just explained beautifully about all the benefits there are. I mean, could there be something wrong with open, having these licenses that are open? What is your worst case scenario? What do you think could happen? Or what should teachers look out for when using open education resources?
Yeah, I think there are some issues that you might look at. So from the user perspective, you need to make sure that you're not using materials that are influenced by certain parties, for example. So you need to make sure what are your sources, as usual. Mm-hmm. It's the same with OER. So if you use the material from the power plant company, then it might be not the right material for your
eco lesson.
Eco lesson.
Yes.
So, yeah. And the other part is, if you create materials, people sometimes are afraid, like, okay, I create these materials and I put all this effort in it, and then somebody sells it. So the question is, what happens if somebody sells a material? So for one, somebody earns a little bit of money, because you don't get rich selling materials that are freely available on the web. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he or she can buy 2 cappuccino. Okay, so what? And the other part is, somebody else bought it and is going to do good teaching with it. So 25 children in the class who bought it, they are going to have a good lesson in school. And that's something, for me, it's okay, let's focus on that part. And this is something also in German schools, we have always this experience of, yeah, you can share it with Claudia, but please don't give it to Julia. So this is my material, and I don't want to share it. And because I'm afraid that the colleague that I never liked is going to shine with it. And so if you want to make sure that people give you credit for your materials, then you can use a CC BY license. That means it's a Creative Commons license where you have to say the name of the person who created the material. It's not the best license for schools because it's making stuff complicated. So the best license for school use is CC0, which is basically a license where you say, do whatever you want with it. But if you're afraid of people using your material without citing your name, then you can use a CC BY license.
Yeah, and that's a best case scenario then. So even in the worst case.
Yeah.
Then how do we motivate teachers to use materials and then to share those materials? Because you can only have open educational resources if there are resources that you can get and share, so that they don't keep them for themselves.
Yeah. So there can be different approaches. For example, NDLA, a platform in Norway, who's doing open education resources for years, since 2006 already. They have one approach that they pay teachers to develop materials. So they get a fixed amount to develop content for a subject. So that would be one option. Another option would be to say, let's build groups of teachers who are very motivated and interested in that subject, and let's try to build something together and then share it among the schools that are involved. So you create some kind of network developing materials. And I think this is one of the best ways to do it, because then you have people that motivate each other and share their experiences. And I think there is a lot of material that is already developed by teachers. And the question is, okay, how could we motivate them to share those materials they already have in their box? So one option, I think, that would be extremely popular with teachers in Germany and Europe is if you would say, well, if you share your materials, you get the recognition of the principal for sharing, and you get 2 flexible free days off, where you can decide, okay, I want this Thursday and I want to go to the wedding of my grandmother or whatever. So
yeah, that's one way of doing it. And I like this idea of teachers coming together on a specific topic, area of interest, to do that. And I'm sure in terms of making materials accessible to learners, so to schools and teachers, the idea that should they have issues with getting materials for learners in whatever needs they have, that this is also an area that they can collaborate on. So, you know, that there is more materials for all learners, that all learners have access. And so that brings me to this idea. You're saying, oh, teachers have materials, they can just put it on. Is there maybe then for our student teachers and teachers who are watching you today, is there something that we can learn from the standards of accessible design for designing digital materials? Or can anything go? And sometimes it might not be good. So yeah. What are the standards?
So looking at the web accessibility standards makes totally sense, because they have the basic guidelines of what to follow, and if you keep those things in mind, you're quite well set up. Nevertheless, there's always more that you can do, and so it's more about a universal design of materials, and this doesn't only benefit students with disabilities, for example, but it's helpful for all learners. So people of different age, people of different social and cultural background, and different language skills, for example. If you have a younger student, he or she might benefit from additional images in the text, because the image then conveys the meaning. It might be as helpful as for a student with cognitive impairments. So if you mix different ways of accessing the meaning,
different modes and
codes, then this helps. And so there are some basics like compatibility for screen readers, so meaningful links. Don't call your download link here, because if you then have click here and here and here, the screen reader will just read here, 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 if it's configured to read the links. So look for clear structures like headings, or also make sure you have alternative texts and who describe the images that are used. Use clear colors, clear contrasts, so to make sure everybody could use the website. Don't make your tiny buttons so small that nobody can miss them on a smartphone. So, and yeah, think about easy easy language, plain English, sign language, because whoever did a text form knows he or she might benefit from easy language. So use glossaries and abbreviation lists to connect complex terms, and provide multiple paths to the same information. So having a version where you read aloud the document and have the images or the video to make it more accessible.
Thank you, Frank. Those were very practical standards and tips to use when developing material, and at the same time, these would also be the same points to remember for teachers when they are accessing the material, that they look at all these points, as you say, big enough text, buttons that are easy to navigate to, different paths of getting to this to the same topics, and so that when they select it with their learners in mind, which of course they have to know their learners to do that. So thank you very much for this very helpful information that you shared with us today.
So the important part is the teachers not only create themselves materials, but they also buy materials. So if the people in power of buying stuff recommend, okay, it must be accessible, then people who create stuff outside of schools also will adapt to the standards more and more and more. So use your power of buying to buy stuff that is already accessible.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.